Education is arguably the most important factor in attaining national economic development. In any country, higher education is both a fundamental requirement in achieving a highly skilled labor force as well as an aspiration of many young people for their own personal development and social mobility. No country can achieve sustainable development without substantial investment in human capital. Despite this knowledge, inadequate and inequitable access to tertiary education remains a major developmental challenge in Jamaica. Good evening. I'm Bradley Perkins, Communications Officer at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. CAPRI is a non-profit public policy think tank with a mission to provide quality evidence-based research in an accessible manner to foster better public policy decision-making in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. From our research, CAPRI also seeks to foster a constructive debate around critical social, economic, and developmental issues. This evening, we will be discussing one of our country's long-standing and now particularly topical issues, the lack of funding for tertiary education. With recent talks of a hike in student fees and a looming skilled labor shortage, I am pleased to welcome you to the launch of our latest report, Footing the Bill, the Hard Choices for Financing University Education, which assesses the funding sources currently available for tertiary education in Jamaica and compares different tertiary education financing models. Shauna K. Chisholm, a researcher here at CAPRI, will present the findings of this report, followed by a panel discussion moderated by our Director of Research, Dr. Diana Thorburn. The panel will also include Dr. Damian King, Executive Director of CAPRI, and Mr. Damian Brown, Group Chief Investments Officer, JMMB. We encourage the members of our virtual audience to participate in the discussion by submitting their questions online using Slido. To do so, visit slido.com and enter the event code CAPRI, after which you will have the option to post or vote up questions you deem crucial for our panelists to respond to. We now welcome Ms. Shauna K. Chisholm to present the findings of the report.
Thank you, Bradley. Did you know what many of us consider as free education is paid for? It is paid for by taxpayers, both rich and poor, including those who have never seen the gates of a university and probably never will. I am Shauna K. Chisholm, a researcher at CAPRI, and over the next few minutes, I will be presenting the findings for our report, Footing the Bill. High-quality tertiary education is a strong point of any society. It drives economic, social, and cultural development. It enhances cultural understanding and civic capabilities, strengthens social responsibility, and creates a stronger democratic society. A quality university is inherently commercially unviable, meaning that no one can make a substantial amount of money operating a high-quality university. The scale and scope of what it takes to run a university, the physical plant, the administration, the faculty. There are three types of universities: for-profit, government-funded public universities, and private universities that are mainly supported by tuition fees and endowment, though they may receive some government subsidy. Some of the best-known universities in the world are private and have the largest endowment, which provides the considerable funding necessary for those universities to deliver quality education and do reputation-enhancing research. Given that tertiary education and a tertiary cohort is important to have, and a quality university is commercially unviable, it then raises the question, how does it get paid for? In Jamaica, inadequate and inequitable access to tertiary education is among the major development challenges. The most important provider of higher education in Jamaica is the University of the West Indies, the UWI. However, the UWI is facing serious funding shortfall that threatens the viability as an institution of higher learning, and particularly as an institution delivering quality education. The idea or the expectation is that the government should pay for its citizens' university education, which is not universal. Very few countries in the world offer a fully governmented funded university. And there are mainly Nordic countries where tax rates are upwards 50% or even as high as 57%. They have progressive taxation, a strong welfare state, and a well developed student support system. Jamaica did, for a period, offer its citizens free education, beginning in 1973 in the context of a wholesale expansion of education. The government paid not only tuition fees, but living expenses. This was a huge improvement, and there was a huge increase in the enrollment numbers by 429%. This, however, left the university in a perilous financial state, which had continued for 4 decades. The legacy of the Jamaican sense of entitlement, they have a right for the university to pay for their education, needs to stop. Since then, UWI has been funded in part by tuition fees and the remainder by a direct grant to the university. That mix changed over the years, but the Jamaican government has never been able to financially support the university as it is now heavily in debt. The current share of the budget allocated to education indicates that the government has placed a great emphasis on education. It is the largest line item in the budget. However, most of the funding goes to, as it ought to primary or basic education. The Jamaican government cannot afford to support the UWI to provide quality education which all Jamaicans have equitable access, nor to increase funding from the current subsidy, and it will not be able to do so in the foreseeable future. Free education in the Jamaican context, less so in the rest of the Caribbean, mainly benefit those who have been able to afford high quality primary education. Due to the structure of Jamaica's education system, the chances are low that a public primary school student will attend a traditional or reputable high school. It is well established that Jamaican children in private or prep school consistently outperform students in the public school. What this does is that it feeds into performance inequalities at the secondary level, as students in reputable traditional high school tend to have better teachers and infrastructure. And even if a student from the lower quintile family makes it to the tertiary level without adequate support, they may not be able to succeed and graduate. Yet, all taxpayer bears the cost of educating the more privileged, bringing about a situation where low-income taxpayers, who themselves have a slim chance of attaining tertiary education, subsidize it for the better off students. This serves to maintain and may even increase the inequality gap. This inequality is made even worse as tertiary graduates migrate. So the poor taxpayer who paid for their education don't even get the benefit of living in a better educated society and all the benefit that comes with it, the economic, social, and cultural gains that are expected from a population that has a high proportion of university educated citizens are lost. The idea or the expectation that the government should pay for tertiary tuition is misbegotten. No one is entitled to a free education because that education in a context like Jamaica is not actually free. And worse, it changes or increases in inequality. The government does have a role to play in university financing, but it is not to pay for students' tuition. Their role is to support the region's development through generating new knowledge. The private sector. The private sector should also play a role, but there are no viable private sector models in funding university. Individual companies do not own social returns. It is like pouring water into a leaking bucket. They do not get sufficient private return to educate mobile human capital. They can, however, make donation towards creating an endowment. The UAE has been attempting to expand this role, but from what we know, this has not yet manifested in a meaningful way. The most effective private sector fundraising mechanism across the world is a matching fund campaign, where a philanthropist or the government, or both, match private donation dollar for dollar. So, who should pay for university education? The person receiving it. How should a quality university be funded? By the people receiving the most benefit from it, the people getting their degrees there. Can this happen in a country like Jamaica in a way that it doesn't harm access, or even from the poorest, from people who have no savings, whose family cannot support them? Yes. Can this be done in a way which is more equitable, where the poor are not paying for the education of the better off? Yes. How can we do this? This can be done with a student loan system that factors in the social and economic realities of Jamaican and the Caribbean societies, that consider that all students, even the poorest, will be able to pay for a university education over their lifetime. That accounts for risk aversion of the poorest student, and it provides living expenses grant for the least well off. The ideal loan model would allow students to gain access to tertiary education without the risk of unpayable debt, and would provide liquidity to universities that would allow to provide high quality education, thus creating a pool of skilled workers to the country and the economy. Such a loan model is the most important recommendation of the study. An income contingent loan scheme is a suitable model for Jamaica. This model shifts the risk to the lender. This way, if the student ends up in a low employment income job or become unemployed, then the debt service obligation automatically adjusts. Students would choose between paying their tuition upfront or deferring payments through the scheme. The debt would be recorded and linked to a student tax registration number. When the student graduates, or for any other reason ceases studying, they would start making contribution, contingent on their income. The contribution would be collected by employers based on the borrower's current income, just like a income tax or any other social contribution. The truth is, any loan scheme has its risk, which the lender and other stakeholders obviously mitigate as best as possible. An important prerequisite for this or any other student loan scheme in Jamaica is that repayment should be collectible from immigrants. There will need to be a bilateral or a multilateral agreement between countries that receive Jamaican migrants regarding the payments of the loan. In all, there is no such thing as free education. Someone has to pay for it, and the only sustainable way is to make it easy and flexible for students to pay.
For that presentation. Welcome to the launch of Footing the Bill. I'm Diana Thorburn, the Director of Research at Capri, And before I introduce my panelists, I'd like to invite our audience to participate in the discussion themselves by going to slido.com and entering event code Capri. There you can pose questions and you can also vote up questions. So if you see a question that you would like answered, you can push it to the top where I will see it and put it to our panelists. Also on Slido is a poll for you to answer, the first of 2 polls. So I'd invite you to answer that and we'll share the results during the course of this evening's panel discussion. My panelists this evening are Dr. Damian King, the Executive Director of Capri, and Mr. Damian Brown, Group Chief Investment Officer. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
At JMMB. But more importantly, their perspectives here are quite useful for the night's discussion. Dr. King was a student at UWI during the period of free education, and he was a lecturer at UWI for 30 years, including during some of the, let's call it, turbulent periods that emerged as a result of this question of who should pay for university education. And Mr. Brown was also a student at the University of the West Indies. Unfortunately for him, not in the time of free education, but also significantly, he was a member of the Tertiary Commission of the recently concluded Education Transformation Commission chaired by Professor Patterson. So he also brings that experience. I'm looking forward to a really productive discussion this evening. And I want to start with a question that I'll put to both of you, and I'll ask Dr. King to answer first and then Mr. Brown, which is, why are we here? This problem has been with us for 40 years. We have had X amount of commissions, Patterson Commission being the last one, which dealt extensively with this question. We've had how many reports? Ours is probably the 6th or 7th at least that we know of on this question. Why are we doing this?
We are here for 2 reasons. One is because, as the report we are launching indicates, it's an intractable problem. It's a real problem here because, as the presentation highlighted, a quality university education is commercially unviable. And so there's a real dilemma to be solved. Why are we still here, which is the nub of your question, is that we have not, in Jamaica at least, faced up to the reality of the problem. And we have spent several years pursuing what should have been foreseen to be unviable solutions. And free tertiary education was one of them, because free tertiary education ultimately resulted in UWI not getting the resources it needed to sustain and reproduce itself. And the quality nosedived.
Mr. Brown, why are we here?
As the report notes, that all countries recognize the value both to the individual and the wider society as to quality tertiary education, but it has a cost, and the question is, who takes that cost and how do we split that cost? And therefore, the inherent conflict between the student who wants to get an affordable education, the government that has other priorities, and the private sector that has a role but has other obligations to society is one that's always difficult. I think the key thing at this point in time that we have recognized is not simply that the government has a role to finance education, but that there are real costs and trade-offs, including to those who don't have the benefit of a tertiary education in terms of the quality of education at other levels. And therefore, hopefully we can see it as the benefit going to the student as well as the wider society, but that the student will have to take a greater portion of that cost. And the question is, how do we do that in an equitable way and one that works for all?
I want to run a vox pop as a preface to a really important but difficult question to talk about, which is the expectation that the government should pay. Can we run that vox pop?
Do you think Jamaicans are entitled to a free university education?
Well, certainly. I can speak for myself in terms of medicine and the expenses. Even if it is not free, it certainly could be less cheaper for students, because I think that's a really big barrier for students who are really dedicated and they really want to do better with their lives, but because of the financial constraints, some of them are limited, and it's really difficult to further finance their education without scholarships, which is not readily available either ways. And so, when you allow free education for students like these, you end up with a better Jamaica in the long run, because these students become more motivated to work, and they will more than likely give back to Jamaica rather than migrating if the education here is free. So they help.
This brings up a really pressing issue, which is the idea that a university education should be free. And my sense, what the report goes forward on the premise that it simply cannot be free, especially a quality tertiary education. We've seen examples of many countries, including right here in the Caribbean, the University of Ghana being a prime example of what happens when a country pretends that it can afford a free quality education. Yet there remains, again, after all this time, a notion, even among the youngest people, the ones who didn't even get to know what happened in the 70s, that it should be free. How are we going to manage this expectation as we go forward?
I think it starts by undermining the notion that it is free in the first place. It is costly to provide this product. You need to pay a whole lot of people who have PhDs and have rent to pay and families to feed and are not going to show up for 40 hours a week and do it for free. The facilities have to be maintained. The labs have to be maintained. The electricity bill has to be paid, to the tune of $30 million a month. So the question is not whether it can be free. The question is, who is to pay that cost? Mm-hmm. And when you frame the question in that way, then you begin to appreciate that some other parent, some other family that is a single mother trying to find lunch money for, her daughter to go to school on that day is going to be asked to pay for the education that somebody else must get for free. Mm-hmm. So these are the difficult trade-offs that we face. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not how can it be free? It really is who is to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Brown, you have been a student not that long ago, and you would have been a student during some of the turbulent times when this question, how are we to treat with this question of this expectation and changing that expectation and changing the notion that people are owed something?
I think the important thing is to frame that opportunity cost, because even if we accept that there's a cost, the question becomes, should it be socialized, or the government have an obligation, or is it a priority in terms of spending given the social impact? And once, as we do what Dr. King says, that it's not simply a cost of the government, but the government has an obligation in terms of quality early childhood education and high school education. And once we understand the inequity that we have there, just looking at the level of passes to traditional high school that come from prep schools relative to primary schools, you're setting up a situation where those who are born into lower socioeconomic conditions are basically put on a track where they don't get to achieve their full human capability and to contribute. And once you frame it in that way, it's not the government versus the student, but the government has an obligation to all. And what we spend on the tertiary actually can take away. Even if we expand the budget, I think it becomes more important, and we can put our minds to the solution, which is really for a student. How do I ensure that I can afford the education, and how do you do it in a manner that reduces the impact on me over time?
But why haven't we had that conversation?
Can I just, if you let me, take off from what Mr. Brown has said? To the student starting the conversation by saying, how can I organize to pay for this education? That is where the state's obligation comes in, and the state's facilitation to say, how can we help you to finance your education? And that kind of leads directly to the recommendation we have made.
Which I want to go to now. Dr. King, I want you to give a layperson's understanding of what the proposal is, this income contingent loan model. And then I want Mr. Brown to talk about it from a financial markets perspective and as an employer.
We know that the return to the student of a university education is significant. When you look at the lifetime earnings of a UWI graduate compared to an otherwise similarly placed person who does not have a UWI degree, the difference in lifetime earnings is not only significant, it is several times greater than the cost of the education. So if we take a lifetime perspective, the student can really afford it. He just doesn't have the cash at the beginning of his life, of his adult life, at the beginning of his degree. So what we really have is a cash flow problem, what people like Mr. Brown would call a liquidity problem. So that points you towards a solution, which is to find a way to allow the student to use his later lifetime income to pay for the education that he has to get up front. And a critical part of that, to say to the student, okay, based on your expected lifetime income, you'll be able to pay back this loan. The student still has a problem because the labor market can be capricious. And even though most students will end up in that position, not everyone does. He may have a medical problem. He may fall on hard times. And so he's stuck with this risk of carrying this heavy student loan burden that he ends up being unable to pay for. So just to be clear, one problem is that he can afford out of later income to pay for university education now. But the second problem is that he's quite rightly afraid to take on the risk. So Capri's proposal is a student loan for which the repayment of that loan is related to how much income the graduate earns. So if the graduate becomes unemployed, the service of that debt automatically goes into abeyance. If he ends up with a lower paying job than he aspires to, the debt service is correspondingly lower. If things work out beautifully for him and he goes into a career path where he's a high earning person, he can pay off the loan more quickly. So that is to say, the student is not taking the risk. He gets the cash up front and he's not taking the debt risk. That is what our income contingent student loan is.
Okay. Give us the reality of it, Mr. Brown.
The reality is that it's a very good notion in that it addresses the two problems that Dr. King spoke to. I think the report highlights some of the issues from a practicality perspective, which is in terms of the enforceability, especially given some of the limited government institutions, the high informality within the economy, and also the fact that though solvable, there's not a clear mechanism for those and the many who migrate having the benefit of having been subsidized, and therefore that cost is not recouped even at the wider social scale, even though there's an argument that remittances also provides a benefit. So the reality is that if we can get those mechanisms to make it practical, then it can be a solution. One thing I would highlight is that part of the issue is ensure that there are the right incentives as well. So it creates the right incentives for the student, but depending on how it is configured, which are some of the issues that we have now, there are the right incentive to collect assiduously, and that there are the right incentive for the student also to choose programs that either align with their life goals or in terms of that value added that's generated over time and that aligns with what the government and the private sector needs in terms of skill sets.
Okay. All right, before we go to some of the questions from Slido, we have the poll results from the first poll, and I'd like to invite our viewers to answer the second poll question, and very curious to see what the results of that will be. Okay, so coming from our audience, we have a kind of a practical question, so I'll put that to you, Mr. Brown. How would you capture self-employed persons or those operating in the informal sector? Is it possible, and how could it be done?
For self-employed persons, definitely what should occur is that self-employed persons provide their tax returns, and that therefore based on those tax returns, outside of it being automatically deducted where you had an employer, then there would be a charge that's assessed just as it's done for other purposes. The reality at this point in time is that it is perceived that there are certain gaps within the collection of taxes. And again, to the informal economy, that creates the challenge that we have at this point in time. I know that in previous discussions around the best way to generate tax revenue for the government while being equitable to others, the question of focusing on consumption taxes relative to heavier enforcement has come up, but that institutional framework would have to be improved for us to have it on a comprehensive level.
Which is something that we have addressed in other research that we've done here at Capri. What's your view on that, Dr. King? How do we manage the very large informal sector with regard to this proposal?
Well, the loan in the first instance is connected to the person's TRN, their tax registration number. And even if you work in the informal sector or you're self-employed, because of your TRN, you interface with state agencies throughout your life. So it's difficult. You can't avoid your obligation. You can't go missing just by being self-employed. You have to go missing entirely, not using the public services, not renew your driver's license for you to escape entirely by just being informal. At any interface with the state where you need to produce your TRN number, then you can be held accountable.
Okay, another question from Slido. These are all very practical questions. I think people are intrigued by this idea. What are the risk measures that you would take to ensure this scheme stays sustainable in cases of migration or unfortunate death?
I think in terms of death, it can be worked into the program, just as the insurance companies work out the probability and therefore the cost. Or worst case, you can insure against it, just as when you take out commercial loans, there are insurance programs that cover the cost of that in an affordable manner. The aspect in terms of the issue of those who migrate, I think can be addressed. That would be for the legal aspects, but it comes back to incentive. How much of a strong incentive is there to pursue those who have not lived up to their obligation, despite having had the benefit of the subsidy, and outside of the clear value from university education, going to higher income countries where it is perceived that the level of disposable income and ability to save is even that much greater. That would have to be worked out, but I'm sure there's a practical solution within there, whether it is from government mandates or having some aspects of that recovery being privatized, where whether it's a collection agency getting X% of what is delinquent and is recovered, so there's that incentive to hold those people accountable and to bring back the value for those who have not received a quality tertiary education.
This, I mean, the way you put it, it sounds to me quite obvious what needs to be done. But why haven't we done this? We've known that this problem of people migrating and not fulfilling their obligations exists. We've known this for as long as we've known it. Why haven't we done anything? It's just simply, I don't know. What are the answers? It's a question I've asked when we embarked on this study.
The solutions that we are proposing here and speculating about are not without their problems. So they are practical and process determining details to be worked out. Especially in relation to the migration problem. It's not that nobody has really thought of it and recognized it. So there is some work to be done in the details. But what is laid out here is a broad approach that certainly can be pushed farther than it has been done so far.
Okay, and then I'm going to take one more question, then we're going to go to our next boss pop, which is, how would the income be measured to make the loan payment affordable? So I suppose that if I understand the question correctly, it's saying, well, what exactly is an affordable repayment, I guess, premium or installment, and how do you estimate what is affordable based on a person's income? Is it a percentage? Does it move?
It would be a percentage, and the percentage would be determined sufficiently low to allow the person to meet the basic necessities of life. So whatever is left over can pay rent and buy food. So it'll be a small percentage. I mean, much less than income tax.
And the initial liquidity to get this thing going. Any thoughts on where we get that from, Mr. Brown? Is this, you know, there have been proposals to use up the unclaimed accounts, the billions and billions of dollars in the unclaimed accounts. Where's the government to get this initial lump sum to provide these loans?
I think there are various considerations. One, depending on the cost of funding, and I think the study speaks to it, the potential to partner with multilaterals for seed funding, and therefore at an affordable interest rate cost, and taking into account the social impact. That's not just a commercial consideration. There are other questions where there are certain low risk aspects that could be funded by the private sector if you have the mechanisms to give a high probability of repayment. Again, the private sector in whatever form has a fiduciary duty, whether it's the pension fund holders or to depositors or investors, to ensure that they get an appropriate commercial return. But if it is structured appropriately where the risk can be fully measured, then it can be financed. And I think the most suitable aspect of it to start out would be where you have those pockets that have both the consideration of the social impact and do not have liquidity concerns, which would more align with developmental institutions.
Okay.
I also think that one should approach a financing not by trying to find any free unused money lying around anywhere, like, you know, unclaimed bank deposits. It is to, I mean, there is no free public money lying around unused. It is to be budgeted for, recognizing that, as the report starts out recognizing that it is important to national development to have a highly educated cohort, which has benefits of promoting development and creating employment for the less educated, and improving social discourse and the function of democracy. So recognizing all of these benefits that are external to the student, that justifies an allocation from the government to seed the fund.
Okay, we have another vox pop that I think is a nice interjection into the discussion that we're having. Can we run the second vox pop, please?
Do you believe that Jamaicans are entitled to a free tertiary education?
No, I do not believe that Jamaicans are entitled to a free tertiary education, because how will the lecturers be paid? How will the light bill be paid? You should pay for your own tuition, not because you're the one that is getting the degree, but you will value it more when you pay for it. You will want to finish, you will want to pass, you will want to, it will also kind of train you to kind of go out there into the work world, to kind of, you know, pay for what you want, aspire for what you want, you know, go for your dreams, achieve. It's a part of personal development for me. And I don't think students should get free tertiary education. No, I think they should pay for it, because how else do people get paid?
So it's not a universal belief. There are citizens who do see it differently. And I want to combine the question I have leading from that with one of the questions from Slido. The question from Slido is, what would be the issues with getting this new scheme to actually happen? And combined with that, it would seem to me that there would also have to be, and I know you dislike this term, Dr. King, some kind of a public education initiative to start to get people to see that, to reframe the situation in many ways, in the ways that that other person did. And, you know, she even brought up points that we didn't, which is, you know, when you pay for something, you value it more. You know, those are issues that we didn't cover in the report, but they're very valid issues as well. So what do we need to do to actually make this happen? From a policy perspective, from an attitudinal perspective, from a societal perspective, how do you see that going?
Okay, that's a broad question. First of all, the details have to be put in place, which is working out the precise percentage, working out how much it'll take to fund it, working out how we are going to implement the problem of migrating students. Once the details are worked out, then It may not require a wide public education campaign. The problem with public education campaigns is that we don't have any evidence that they work and which ones work and why. And so we tend to assume that a public education campaign is the solution to every single social and economic ill the country has. But we certainly do want to make sure we target the prospective students, the potential matriculants into the University of the West Indies, so that they have an appreciation of why it is in their interest to get into the program.
How would you, and I imagine that this was also discussed at the commission, how are we going to get that shift from this expectation, as the first Vox Pop showed, to a more practical and realistic expectation of what people are due and what is their own obligation?
I think part that has been covered by the Educational Transformation Commission and in this study is that there's a huge opportunity cost. It's not simply the matter of the government funding, it is that early childhood education is underfunded, and we have created our almost dual class system where, again, if you're born with a certain income and social conditions, almost automatically you're put on the back leg despite the great potential you may have relative to somebody who is born in a different area, and that cannot be good for the society overall or morally correct. Once we frame it from that moral impact and that impact on society, I think it creates a greater issue from whether government should fund the student and just where should government funding go for education, while ensuring that there is access for the individual. And by placing the question on access for your funding, not that the government funds it, but how do you have appropriate access, then I think it carries us down the path of what is the appropriate mechanism to give potential graduates the kind of funding that works for them.
You know, in the report, Dr. King, you would know, we did see a role for the government in tertiary. We didn't get to go into it too much in the presentation because we wanted to focus on the main recommendation of the loan proposal. But talk to us about what the government's obligation ought to be in the context of their own limited resources and the priority being where it ought to be on basic and primary.
Well, the government's obligation starts from the fact that the wider economy benefits from the existence of a cohort of highly educated persons. We've already indicated that lots of broad benefits come from that. So the government's interest is in putting in place a system that is going to deliver that. It doesn't suit the government or anybody to have a university whose quality runs down so much that it produces graduates that don't have the required skills. And it is not in the government's interest either to have a university where the students with the greatest potential are not the ones that matriculate and pass through. And this comes back to Damian's point about funding early childhood education and the lower tiers of the educational system. Because with the inadequate funding at that level, then we end up disadvantaging the potentially brighter students who don't end up matriculating because the opportunities at that lower level are so poor. So the government has a responsibility to looking after the lowest educational levels to ensure that the brightest students get to the point where they can matriculate for the university, and then the income contingent loan scheme allows them to finance themselves through to completion.
Before I go to you, Ms. Brown, can we get the results of the second poll? We probably should have done this as a before and after, because we seem to have convinced people that Jamaicans are not entitled to a free tertiary education. We have quite a significant majority that don't think that they should. But it would have been interesting if we'd asked at the beginning and then at the end. Remember that for the next time. I want to ask you, Mr. Brown, there is a role for the private sector. And what the research found was that in several countries across the world, there has been great success with something called a fund matching scheme. Right. I had never heard of it before, but I'm convinced by the evidence. Is that something, how do you think that would work from a private sector perspective? I think there's an element of competition in it, and it gets more prominence, especially when philanthropists are involved. Do you think something like that could work in Jamaica, that kind of a scheme?
I think there's definitely a benefit. If you take it more widely, that even within our those who have migrated, they still have an emotional interest in Jamaica to contribute to its development, whether or not they may contribute to their outstanding student loans. By creating mechanisms that allow them to donate and to see the benefit of that donation over time. And there's a technical element where in those countries also, there are tax benefits to making those donations as well. So it has the dual benefit of benefiting self and wider society. So if you could find a way to establish it so that they get that benefit, they get that emotional benefit, and it's structured in a way that people can believe and emotionally relate to the impact that they're having, I do think there is a significant benefit. Will it accrue the level of interest or the level of benefit that we see in other countries? Maybe not, but it would still be material relative to where we are at this point in time.
I think what the study, in the cases that the study covered, I think the success of it surprised even the universities themselves that embarked on it, to the point where they then replicated it for other universities, because other universities in the country started to complain that they wanted in on the action as well. But when we're doing the research, one of the challenges that we had was getting information from the university. They have an alumni association. They have announced several initiatives over the years of private sector fundraising. And we have to think, well, why is it that we're not getting this information as a public institution? I don't know if they're subject to access to information requests. We didn't go down that road. But to what extent is that lack of transparency, as we've seen it in this particular case? How do we understand it in this broader question of this intractable problem that we still have not yet managed to figure out?
It's easier when you look at Jamaica's tertiary education landscape. We have, without any disrespect to the other universities, we have one research-oriented university. And this is not to say that research does not take place at the other universities, but we have one dominant research-oriented university. And so that's not a competitive landscape. One of the reasons why Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford are able to raise endowments is because their graduates are competing with the graduates of the other universities. That competitive element in Jamaica exists with the high schools. People identify strongly with their high schools, whether it's KCR, Calabar, or JC, and not with the university, because nearly everybody goes to UWI.
Yeah. You were a student there, Mr. Brown. How would this kind of a conversation have gone down in your time as a student? Do you think students would have been open to this kind of a proposal, or was the expectation too firmly set in at that time?
I have a definitive answer. It would have gone very poorly. I remember the then finance minister having a discussion, I think it was the master's class, and pointing to the issue of the costs and the other priorities. And again, the fact that education is not free. And what I would say is that the important thing is incentives, because everybody sees things from their perspective, right? And even as a student at that point in time, when you look at what your economic reality was, you weren't necessarily aware of the fact that you were being subsidized so highly, regardless of the fact, given the constraints it would have had on you otherwise. So noting that people do have their own realities and that there are incentives that need to be addressed, I think is the important part. And if I may, from the Commission's recommendations, it was recognized that for the social good, you should split out that funding explicitly. So there should be funding for research. There should be a funding that's tied to what the government considers, after consultation with the private sector, the strategic skill sets and needs for that future workforce that will be down to everybody's benefit. And then there would be other considerations in terms of facilitating the financing for the students. So going back to the issue that there's those who would have had not only a subsidized education cost, but a low education cost relative to the incomes that they now earn abroad, but they're not necessarily paying what a relatively low student loan. Personal incentives are important as we structure the appropriate way forward.
This question of, you know, increasing competition, increasing a greater allegiance to the school, to the university, you know, this is something that you must have grappled with in your time there, as well as you. I don't know how active you are in the Alumni Association. I'm an alumnus and I pay my dues. But, you know, how are we going to get that culture change? You know, what are some of the things we need to think about in changing the culture of how alumni view the university and their obligation to the university, not just to repay loans, but also to doing matching schemes or other whatever fundraising. You know, when I graduated from my US university, in my graduation packet was my alumni license plate, which I put on my car right away, and my stickers and so on. And it was that made me actually join the UE Alumni Association, because I thought I can't be an alumnus of this university and I've gone to this one and I haven't signed up. So it was almost a guilt that I felt, that an obligation. But is there a cultural issue that we need to address in increasing allegiance, maybe, or people's obligation, graduates' obligation to the university?
You know, I have had an easier job getting rid of pets who would not leave my leg alone than I have had getting rid of the newsletter from my undergraduate school in Canada. It followed me everywhere, even though I never sent a change of address. So they invest a lot of effort in building relations with their alumni. And importantly, that effort begins not when you graduate. It begins when you arrive at the school with a strong student-oriented focus. So that is something I think that we need to appreciate more.
Damien, I don't know how involved you are with the alumni, but you know, you've certainly among the graduates that have made the university proud. What's the sense among UE alumni in terms of what they feel is their obligation, and what part do they feel they ought to play, and what part are they playing?
I think there has to be a cultural change, going back to the issue of whether people, even those on student loan, perceive that they've gotten a benefit with a high level of subsidization. I would guess no. They actually see it as a nuance and something that they should not be under at this point in time. So having that appreciation of the social value that you have gotten, I think, is either starting place. Dr. King spoke to the engagement. I must say that there is the communication given out, how widely people identify with an emotional perspective with the university. I think there's a gap. There was a conversation earlier in terms of, at least from my classmates, how well they have done both locally and internationally. But do we accrue, it just came to me as we were having a discussion, that success partly to the benefit that we got at the university. And I think there are opportunities to explore there, having that emotional connection in terms of your success with the benefit and the quality of the training you would have received there.
Okay, well, we're coming to the close, and I want to ask you a last question. Usually I ask you to give final thoughts, but I actually want you to take what we've discussed here to some of the current things. We're in an unprecedented situation in Jamaica with the lowest unemployment rate ever. This, you know, what in any other time would have been a preposterous notion that we have to import labor. At the same time, as the report points it out, and we've heard it over time, that the university has not done a good enough job of estimating or measuring what needs are and filling those needs. How do we think about where the university ought to be going, given this, you know, almost new world that we find ourselves in terms of lack of skills, low unemployment?
I have to tell you, I think that's a great last question, because we have record low unemployment. But as everybody will tell you, the skill level of that employment, and therefore the productivity and the pay it can earn, is not impressive. So the need to import labor is a recognition, is an exposing of the fact that we have failed to educate our labor force sufficiently at every level. And that is precisely why this discussion and the study on which it is based is so important. Because until we can solve the problem that we are here discussing and that the Capri report addresses, then we're going to continue to have this problem. Indeed, it's going to get worse, where we have to import the skills that we are not able to reproduce as a society.
You're an employer, Damien. How are you grappling with this unusual situation that we find ourselves in, and what is the role of the university?
I think the role of the university is to do a better job. It's always an opportunity to improve in terms of matching the skill sets that are needed within the labor force and going forward as well. With respect to the resource allocation, and therefore incentives are important. We're still, I think, as a society where it's the lawyer, the doctor, the engineer, while if you look online, there's a joke that there's one industry where you have 0% unemployment, which is cybersecurity. And the allocation of resources relative to where the world economy is going is not there. And it was recognized, again, with the recommendation that the government has to set the priority in consultation with the private sector as to what are the skill sets it wants and to allocate the funding based on that. So the universities have to allocate it based on what are the strategic priorities. And there's that loop in terms of what does the private sector want, what is the university seeing, what is the government setting up Jamaica to win, and we get the maximum impact from that, which will benefit the graduates as well in terms of having jobs in the future and having jobs that, to Dr. King's point, both productively contribute and therefore can earn a more attractive wage.
Okay. All right, so just one last Slido task for our audience is to have a look at the last poll that we did, asking our viewers if their own pursuit of tertiary studies was hindered by a lack of funding. And right now we're at 50-50. So I suppose that speaks to the fact that some people are better off than others. This is the end of our panel discussion and our report launch. The report is available on our website at capricaribbean.org, along with all of our other reports. We invite you to download them for free, read them, engage with us on social media, and other events that we will have coming forward out of this report, as well as other reports to come. I'm going to hand over to Bradley to take us out this evening.
Discussion. The Capri team would like to extend a special thank you to our external panelist, Mr. Damian Brown, for agreeing to be a part of tonight's panel. We would also like to say thank you to our corporate sponsors and to you, our virtual audience, for tuning in. Tonight's report will be available on our website at capricaribbean.org. Before we leave, we have one last request for our viewers, and this is for you guys to revisit Slido to rate tonight's event. Be sure to look out for the launch of our upcoming report, which explores gender-based violence in Jamaica. Don't forget to join us on Instagram on Sunday, May 1st at 6 p.m. for Conversations with Capri, where our Director of Advocacy, Dr. Leon Levers, alongside Executive Director, Dr. Damian King, will be answering all your questions regarding the report. Once again, thanks for joining us. Have a good night.